In this section, we're going to add a skeleton so that we can start controlling our model. And then we'll set up a custom rig so that we can control multiple bones at once with single controllers, which is called inverse kinematics, or IK for short. Now, before we start adding the skeleton, or as Blender calls it, the armature, onto our robot, let's just have a look at the basics of armatures. So in a new scene, we'll press Shift A, and we'll add a new armature. And it's basically the same as any other object, but instead of containing geometry, like edges, vertices, and faces, it contains bones instead. And it's useful because basically we can create our own skeleton to fit perfectly with whatever object we want it to control. And it also comes with a lot of tools that are specific to the armature to make animating characters much easier. And the armature comes with two modes. So if we go into the tab menu, you can see we've got edit mode, just like we've got with normal objects, but we've also got a pose mode. So edit mode is where we can create the bone structure, we can add new bones, we can scale them and position them perfectly to the mesh that we want it to control. And then pose mode is where we can use keyframes or constraints to animate the bones that we've set up. So let's firstly look at edit mode. So in edit mode, we can add bones or change the position or scale of bones by choosing a bone and then scaling it, moving it around or rotating it, just as you'd expect in any other Blender mode. But we can also add new bones by extruding from existing bones, and any bone that you extrude will be a child of that bone, so that if in pose mode I rotate, say for example, the parent, the child will come along for the ride, and we can specify, go into edit mode, what attributes of the parent the child will inherit. So if we go down here, we've got two new tabs. We've got the data tab. This is the properties that we can set up for the entire armature, such as viewport display. We can always make sure that the bones are in front of any meshes that they might be inside of, so they're easy to see and select. And then we've got the bone properties, where we can check and change the various options for the individual bones. So for example, this one, we can see its parent is bone 002, which is this one, and it's inheriting the rotation and it's also connected. So this means in pose mode, if I rotate its parent, it's going to inherit the rotation of this one as well. Whereas if I just turn off inherit rotation and then rotate this one, you'll see it's going to continue, this one is going to continue looking where it was looking before. It's no longer inheriting that rotation from the parent. And we go into edit mode, we can also change whether or not it's connected. So if I choose this one, and it is connected, if I move it, then the bones that are connected to it are going to change in shape to make sure that they stay connected. So for example, this one, both of the connected bones are being modified in scale to make sure that they stay connected. Now, if I choose not to connect it, I can move this around and it's no longer going to influence the shape of the previous bone. And this is useful if, for example, you're wanting to make your bone structure for, say, for example, our robot, the finger joints aren't going to be aligned perfectly. So we couldn't have a finger joint here and then have one over here, because as soon as I move this one, if it's leave it as connected, you'll see this bone changes position, and now it's no longer going to be aligned to the joint, to that mesh joint that we created. So that's why turning off connected can be quite useful. So let's undo that. And we won't go into too much detail now. We're going to go through it in depth as we go through. But basically just realize we've got the options for the entire armature, and then we've got the options for the individual bones as well. We can also add bones by Shift A, and that will add a bone that isn't connected to anything. So again, you can see it in the relations, it doesn't have a parent and it's not connected. And that just means that no matter what we do, this one's not going to be influenced. Okay, so let's go into edit mode and we'll get rid of this. So delete that bone. And if we go under the armature, you can see we've got two poses. We've got the pose position and the rest position. And whatever you create in edit mode, this is called the rest position, and it's basically the default position that you can always revert to if you get in a bit of a mess in pose mode, or you want to restart the animation from the rest pose position. Let me just show you that. So we're going to pose mode. We're now looking at the pose position, and if I rotate this, we've now got two different positions. We've got the pose position and the rest position, which we can see this in pose mode as well. So click on that one. That's the edit mode position, basically. And if I don't like it, I can then revert to the rest pose position using clear transform for either rotation, scale, or location, or all three. And that will make the pose position match the rest position once again. Now, pose mode, which we're already in, is where we can animate the object. So let's have a look at the two different ways we can animate. Well, in actual fact, there's three different ways we can animate. We can either use forward kinematics, inverse kinematics, or we can just use constraints on their own. So let's have a look at that. I'm going to create three different versions. So Shift-D, X, we'll do another one. And let's firstly look at forward kinematics. So I'm going to isolation mode. And forward kinematics basically means once we're in pose mode, we can select all of the bones. I'm going to press I to record a keyframe at the current state. And again, the keyframe is just recording a bone's position at a particular point in time so that you can record different positions and it will interpolate between them to create an animation. So let's go to frame 80. And with forward kinematics, we basically animate the individual bones to get the movement that we want, like that. And then I'll select all the ones that I've changed and I'll press I. This is going to add a new keyframe on whichever frame I'm currently on for all of the selected bones. And if we play this back, we've created a forward kinematic animation by manually animating those bones individually. So let's come back out of pose mode into object mode, out of isolation mode, and the next method is using inverse kinematics. So let's look at this one. So inverse kinematics, we need to use a constraint. So we come to constraint, make sure we're in pose mode first. This is the only place where constraints are active. We can't add them in edit mode. You can see the constraints tab's gone. So we're going to add to this bone, we need to add a inverse kinematics constraint, and we need to tell it a target. So the target object is going to be whichever object is going to control this inverse kinematics constraint. So we need to create an object. So I go into edit mode and I'm going to create a new bone from this one. So I can press E, extrude it out, and then we'll go into the bone properties and just make sure it doesn't have a parent. And now I should be able to move this one around without affecting any of the other bones. And the other bones also won't affect that either. Okay, so we'll go back into pose mode. I'll go back into this bone, into the constraints, and I'm going to say the target is going to be this one here. So it's basically the armature. And then we need to specify which bone of this armature I want to be the controller. It's going to be this one. I'll just rename it to, so F2, and we'll rename this one to IK controller. And then we'll specify that in here. So IK controller, in the constraint. Now if I move this, you'll see we're able to animate all of those bones now at once. We're no longer having to do it one by one. And that's what makes inverse kinematics, or IK for short, a bit more easy, but not necessarily always gives you the amount of control that you need. So you're sometimes going to have to flick between FK and IK, depending on the result that you need. But we'll come to all that later. And pole targets we'll cover later. Basically that is just adding another bone to tell the overall shape which way it should be pointing, regardless of where we move this. So if I move this down here, I might want this, let's say, imagine this is an elbow, to be pointing over here, but still ending over there. And that's what your pole target would be for. In fact, let's just do one quick. So we'll do that. We'll choose this. I'll go into edit mode and I'll just add another bone. So I'll extrude one out. and I'll press Alt P this time, so we can see it's got a parent. We can just use Alt P, just like we can in object mode, to clear the parent. And now it's no longer got a parent. We can move it away somewhere else, maybe over here. And then we'll go back into pose mode, choose this again, the one that's got the constraint on it. And then we can specify which bone to use for the pole target. So it's going to be this one. I'll rename it F2, we'll call it pole. Back into this one, and then we'll say use the pole. Sometimes it flicks to the wrong direction, so you just have to modify the pole angle until it's pointing where it should be. So -90 in this case. And now it's pointing exactly at this. So I can now control where the elbow is going to be pointing, regardless of where we move this. So that's really handy for things like elbows and knees. Now an armature can contain bones that are both IK and FK, and those bones can be swapped between IK and FK as well. But you can't animate a single bone with both IK and FK at the same time. The other constraints, like the child of and the floor constraints and the look at constraints, they can be used in combination with both IK and FK. And it's actually incredibly straightforward to set up, as we'll see later as we start getting into the animation section of the tutorial. Now let's come back into object mode, back out of isolation, and then we'll look at some of those constraints we just mentioned as well that we can use on their own or in combination with both IK and FK. So into pose mode, isolation mode for this one. And we'll firstly add an object, so Shift A, make sure we're in object mode, Shift A, and we'll go with a Suzanne. Maybe scale it down a bit and apply the scale just to avoid any strange behavior. We'll go into the armature again, into pose mode, choose the end bone, and then in the constraints, or the bone constraints rather, not to be confused again with the normal constraints, we'll add a constraint that can make the bone always look at the Suzanne. So the track to is a look at constraint basically. So let's choose this, and we'll choose the target to be Suzanne. We just need to change a few settings to tell it which axis to look along. So if we have a look at the local axis of the bone, let's turn on the gizmo. We can see it's the Y axis and it's pointing, the arrow is pointing this way, so it's the Y positive. So let's turn this to Y positive. Make sure we change the up axis to be something other than Y, so Z for example. And now it's looking exactly at Suzanne. So if I come out into object mode and move this, we're now animating the bone using the movement of Suzanne. And constraints can be used not just for following objects and things, you can also use it to make sure it doesn't go beyond a certain distance from something, or that it stays exactly rotated in alignment with something on a particular axis. So you can choose an axis to stay aligned to, say for a joint, for example. You can make sure it doesn't go through the floor. So if you've got a foot and you want the foot bone to never go beneath the floor, you can use a floor constraint, specify which is the floor object, and then no matter what you do with your animation, that bone won't be able to go through the floor, which can be quite useful. And child of is another very useful one. This, for example, is if you've got an animated ball and you want the hand to follow along perfectly with the movement of the ball. That would be an absolute nightmare to try and do manually by keyframing the position of the bone on each frame to keep it staying stuck to the ball. So this is where you could use the child of constraint, and that would mean that it would just stick to it automatically without you needing to do any work. So really useful. Okay, so that's a very basic overview of armatures. We'll get into more detail as we continue through the course, but I think for now we're ready to move on to the next video, which is setting up the armature. To make things easier, we'll turn on the Rigify add-on. So go into the add-on preferences and just type Rig and enable the Rigify add-on. With that done, make sure the 3D cursor is at 0, world 0, so Shift C, and then we'll do Shift A, and we're going to add the Human Meta Rig. We're going to scale it down until it's approximately the right size. And just to make it easier, let's go into front view and we'll turn on X-ray, and we'll go into side view. That's looking quite good. So with that done, we'll start moving it more into place, and we'll temporarily hide the eyeball and the lips so we can see things more easily. Let's just isolate this temporarily. We'll make a few modifications. So press tab and go into edit mode. We don't want these two nipples. So X, delete the bones. On the hands, we don't need these top parts. So delete those, X, bones. And then we can delete all of these bones on the face that we don't need. So I'll quickly do that. And we can get away without having these two as well. Now you'll notice that on our rig, if we just come out of here, we've only got one pelvis sort of rotation that happens, and then we've got one big spine. So we don't need all those additional spine pieces, we just need one. We need two in fact, so one for the pelvis, and then one for the bit that rotates, and then all the way up to the neck. So I'll take into edit mode again, this one, Control X, and that'll make that into one big bone up to the neck. We'll come out of isolation mode. We'll hide the body. With the skeleton selected, go into edit mode and we'll delete all of the bones on the right hand side. So let's start getting it into place. In the bones, go into view, viewport display, and just click in front, and that'll make it easier to see them at all angles. I'm going to come out of edit mode, I'm going to select this object, I'm going to say Shift S, cursor to selected. We'll select the armature and go into edit mode, and then we'll select the tail of the thigh bone, and we're going to say Shift S, selection to cursor. Is select this model, Shift S, and I'll say cursor to selected. Now select this, Shift S, selection to cursor. And then we'll do the same for the ankle. And then select the entire toe and slide that across so it's central to the foot. Now you'll notice that the foot bone is rolled a little bit to the left. It's not pointing straight up, but that's fine because we're going to be emulating a ball and socket joint. In other words, it can rotate in any direction, so that doesn't really matter. But when we get to the hinge joints, the bone that's going to be moving that hinge needs to be perfectly aligned in terms of how it's twisted so that it points exactly forwards in line with that joint. Otherwise, the entire mechanism will sort of become all wobbly, which is not what you want. So basically, we need to find a way to automatically roll this bone so that it's exactly aligned with the hinge that it's going to be controlling. And it's really straightforward. We'll go into pose mode, and we're going to say add a constraint, and it's going to be a copy rotation. So click on this. The target I want to be this part here. We'll make sure we change it to local space, and for the owner, I'm going to say custom space, and we're going to choose the same part of the hinge object again, and that will give us a perfectly aligned result. Now if you get really strange results like this, basically it means you've done the constraint in the main constraints for the entire armature instead of for the bone. So make sure you do it in the bone constraint, and then that will work properly. So just get rid of this one, go into the bone constraints, and I've set this one up already, and then it's going to work straight away. Once you've done that, apply this, Control A, select this bone, into edit mode. On this bone, we need to untick connected, back into object mode, and then we'll go into pose mode, and we'll select these bones, and just go into the pose menu and say apply to the rest pose. And that'll make sure that the bones are in the same location in edit mode and pose mode as well. So this one is now not connected. If we go into pose mode, we can actually move this one around. That's fine. And the other one, we can just move that upwards a bit, and make sure you choose to move it along the bone's own Y normal. That will make sure that when you move it up and down, it doesn't introduce any roll into the bone, which would undo all that work we did by aligning the bone to the hinge in the first place. As you can see here, if I change the orientation to local and then move it up and down on the Z, the roll is actually changing on the right hand side there, which would throw everything out when we start animating. and now move it on the Y. The bone will always face the Y axis. Right, that's fine. So this one now, we need to start moving this around again. So make sure in edit mode, and also make sure the 3D cursor is aligned with the origin of the swivel joint there, which it is. So with the little tail nub of the foot selected, do Shift S and do selection to cursor, and that'll move that into place. Now all we need to do is select the toe bits and just move those into place. Easier to do in a top view, so I've just gone into the top orthographic view. I'm just moving these roughly into the right place. You don't have to be perfect. There we go. And in actual fact, we don't need this bone, so let's just delete this bone. And then we'll just align this bone with the front of the foot. So basically what we've done there is make sure that when we rotate this bone, so if I go into pose mode and I rotate this on the local axis, so RZ, it will rotate exactly in line with that joint that we modelled earlier, that hinge joint. So we'll move on to the spine area and start aligning all this. So this piece, Shift S, cursor to selected, into edit mode, this piece here, and say Shift S, selection to cursor. Out of edit mode, and we'll do this all the way along, Shift S, cursor to selected, and select these bones, into edit mode. This one we can actually say is connected, that's fine. So connect that up, and then we've only got to move one, Shift S, selection to cursor. We'll do the same for the other two socket joints. And for this one, we'll just use pose mode to rotate it into place. And we'll just say pose, apply to rest pose, bring this across, so it's in the middle of the hand area, making sure you're in edit mode, of course, for the bones. And then we'll start working on these. So this one, Shift S, cursor selected, and then we'll select the tail nub of this finger joint and then do selection to cursor. And we need to make sure these fingers aren't connected. So we're going to select each finger in edit mode, go into the bone, and just make sure we turn off connected. And this is because these joints aren't lined up perfectly. If these joints were in a perfectly straight line, then we could keep them connected. But if we've got them connected, then it will be impossible for each bone's roll to be aligned perfectly to the mechanical joint that we modelled that is going to be controlling it. Because if they're connected, once we align one and then move on to the next one, when we align the next one, because they're connected, it will affect the roll of the previous one, taking it back out of alignment. So disconnect all these. What we can do in actual fact, we'll just select them all. Select all those, Alt click, and then they should all become disconnected, as you can see there. Alright, so take this one, we'll bring it roughly down. We don't need to worry about aligning the roll of the bone with the geometry that is going to be controlling it just yet. We'll do that afterwards. Just for now, we'll bring them all roughly into position with the joints. And for each of these bones, we're going to go into pose mode, select this bone. We're going to do the same as we did before. So let's add on this one, the thumb one, copy rotation, or we'll copy location first, and then we'll add a copy rotation. I'll leave them blank purposefully at this point. But what I will do is make sure that on the copy location, I've got target. I'll leave those as world, that's fine. But on the copy rotation, we change the target to local and the owner to custom. We'll leave the targets blank, and that will allow us to now copy. Select all these, and then click this one last. So shift, click on this one, and we can do pose, constraints, and then copy constraints to selected bones. Now all of these constraints, all these bones have got the same constraint, and we can start choosing the target. So we'll choose this one first, we'll do E, we'll align it to this one. And then we'll do copy rotation, E, and we'll align it to this one as well. They both share the same pivot, so that's fine. In order to get it to rotate, we also need to go back into the options for the copy rotation, down to the object, press E, and then just click on that hinge object again, and that will rotate it. So this one now, we're going to do into the constraint. We'll do the same for all of them. This time we're going to use this one, this one, this one. And what I would also say is when you're choosing the target, choose the front part of the hinge, not the back part. Because if you choose the back part and you've rotated the front part upwards a bit, then the bone is not going to be aligned to the front part's upward rotation. So choose the front part and that'll make sure that doesn't happen. So I'll speed this up now, so I'm just going to do the same thing for each of these fingers. Alright, and then those bones are all perfectly aligned. But we do want to get rid of those constraints now and make it so that they're permanently applied. So, still in pose mode, we'll select all the fingers that the constraints are applied to. And then we'll go to the pose menu, apply, and apply selected as rest pose. And then we can do pose, constraints, clear pose constraints. And because we've applied it to the rest pose, they're all in place. And for any that are too long, like this one for example, you can just select it in edit mode, make sure we're in normal mode again. And then we'll GY, bring it in. And when you're moving these, just make absolutely certain that on the right hand side there, when you move them, the value in the roll doesn't change. Because if that changes, then you're basically undoing all the hard work that we've just done. And there we are. So this one here, go back into pose mode. This one's not rotated correctly. So I'll just quickly correct this using the same method as before. Just double check, it's all lined up correctly. And now if we go into pose mode and rotate this, you'll see it all rotates. Now what we also need to do, which we'll come to in a second, is make sure these can only rotate on the local Z axis. And because we've aligned them perfectly, you'll notice if I go local here, look at the transform coordinate on this. So Z is pointing exactly that way. That will match the pose mode transform of the bone itself as well. And lastly, we need to do the neck. So the neck, we've got two pieces that move. Well, we've actually got three. We select this bone, we go into edit mode. Let's move this, it's not connected. Let's just move it out of the way to make it easier. We'll select this one, Shift S, cursor to selected, select the bone, this one, Shift S, selection to cursor. And then for this one, Shift S, cursor to selected, back into bone, Shift S, selection to cursor. And then this one, Shift S, cursor to selection, Shift S, selection to cursor. And this one here, we can get rid of that. And if you find that some of your neck bones aren't pointing forward, so this one isn't going to be aligned correctly with the hinge, what we can do is try firstly, before using the method we used before with the rotation constraints, we can just try selecting the bone in edit mode and just set the roll to 0. So if I set this to 0, it should hopefully become back in line with the bone below it, and that's aligned it perfectly. And we can do the same just by choosing it and pressing Alt-R, which will do the same as coming into the armature menu, bone roll, clear the bone roll. Alright? So it's very important that these again are aligned with the hinge, and if the Alt-R method doesn't work for you, make sure you use the method we use on the fingers, using those constraints for the copy rotation. And now obviously, so he's not a one-legged, one-armed robot, we need to get these copied across to the other side of the object. So we're going to go into the armature, into edit mode first, just get rid of any bones that are left behind from this side of the armature. So delete that one. We'll select all of the bones on this side. Careful not to select the ones in the middle. Just move them around to make sure you've got them all. And just make sure that your robot and the armature are looking along the y-axis. Because when we right-click now and choose symmetrize, we've only got the option to use an X direction, either negative or positive. So it must be facing this way first. And the beauty of doing it the symmetrize way, some people do it by scaling it on a -1. But this has got the benefit, if we go into each bone in pose mode, you'll notice this bone here was initially called upper arm R, and this one now on the symmetrize side is called upper arm L. So it's automatically renamed them for us. And additionally, it's made sure that the pose mode transform has also been mirrored. As you can see here, this one points Y this way, and this one points Y this way. And another thing as well, when you use the symmetrize method, the bones get correctly rolled when you move them across. So all that work we did with the alignment constraints, with the transform and rotation constraints, we've managed to keep all that roll data correctly. Whereas if we'd have scaled on the -1 axis, that roll data would have been lost. So just to be safe, always make sure you use the symmetrize option. The next thing we want to do is just come out of pose mode, go back into object mode, and we're going to give the armature its own container just so we can hide it. Then we'll find it over here by pressing full stop on the numpad, just turn it off with the eyeball. We need to mirror these objects across to this side of the robot as well. And we're going to need to unhide the body, of course. So go back up to the top here, and we'll turn the body back on. So we've got all the data, and just go into wireframe mode, and we're going to X-ray as well. Make sure we get everything we need. So select everything on this side. Be careful not to get anything in the middle, and just make sure you've got it all. We'll change the pivot point to be the 3D cursor. Put the 3D cursor back to the world origin, Shift C, and then we'll do Shift D to duplicate these, right click to snap them back into place, and we'll do Object, Mirror, X Global, and that will mirror those across. And come back out of wireframe, and now we can start parenting the objects to the relevant bones on the armature. So let's unhide the armature. Let's have a quick double check everything's okay. So a few issues with it. Let's just go into edit mode. We need to align the roll of these arm bones to the hand bone. So they need to be pointing straight up basically. So just select this one, and then lastly click this one. So this one's the active bone. And we'll do Shift N. We'll choose to align the roll to the active bone. That'll put both of those in line. Or if your hand bone wasn't pointing straight up, what we'll need to do instead is do Shift N, and we'll align this to the global Z. And now it's going to be pointing straight up, and then these two we can now select. And select this one last, Shift N again, and align to the active bone. So these two are now going to be aligned to that. We'll do the same on this side of the model. So this one, and finally this one, Shift N, active bone. They're aligned. And then for the feet, they're probably okay, but just to be sure, we'll click this one, shift click this one, Shift N, and we'll choose to align it to the positive global Z axis. So they're pointing straight up. We don't want to mess with these ones, obviously, because these are perfectly aligned to the part of the joint they're going to be rotating around. And these are fine as well. And the neck, that's all fine as well. So let's start parenting. We'll go back into object mode so we can select the geometry. We need to select the objects that we want to parent to the bone first. So we're going to select this shoe and then this part of the joint. Lastly, shift click on the armature, go into edit mode or pose mode, and then click on the bone that we want to parent to. Come back out into object mode, and with all three still selected, we'll do Ctrl P and then choose to parent to the bone. If we go into pose mode, choose this bone, just make sure you set the pivot point back to the median. And if we rotate this now on the local x-axis, you'll see it all rotates correctly and it all follows along as well. We'll do the same for all the other geometry. So top part, back out into object mode, this one, and the inside part of this one. Shift click on the armature, choose the bone, Ctrl P, bone. And a bit of a problem I've just noticed, if I go into pose mode now and rotate this, you'll notice all the legs rotating. So I need to firstly separate this leg out into two parts. Come out of this mode, select both legs, into edit mode, A to select all, and then P, and we'll separate by loose part. And then continue. So we're going to choose this one, the outside part of the knee joint, and then this part here. Choose the bone in edit mode, back out into object mode, Control P, assign to bone. We'll do this all the way up the model, choosing all the bits that need to be attached to the relevant bones. And then this piece, and actually this piece as well. So we don't actually need this bone here. Let's go into edit mode. We'll get rid of that. And we'll get rid of these two bones here as well. We don't really need them. So I'll select this bone, and I'm going to select this object, and this object, and this object. Shift click on here, Control P, parent to the bone. Just double check it. Yeah. And then this object here, we're going to parent to the inside part. So Control P, and this time parent to object. This one, I'm going to parent to this one. Control P, object. This one, parent to this one. Control P, bone. On this one, did I do it correctly? So let's just check relations. Parented this one to an object. It should have been parented to the bone. We'll do Alt P, clear the parent. We'll do that one again. So this one, here, Control P, bone. And then this one, parent to this one. Let's just test that out. That's all working. And then we'll parent the shoulder sockets to the spine object. And then this one, onto this one, bone, this one, You'll notice this is one piece, so into edit mode, A, P, select by loose parts, back out into object mode, right click, and we'll set the origin to the geometry so that each object's origin is at the center of that geometry. We'll choose this one, and then we're going to choose the knuckle joint, that one, and that one, and also on the thumb. Choose this one, Control P, bone. And for the finger and thumbs, we'll parent the inner part of the joint to the bone that's ahead of it, the hand mesh to the bone that is underneath it, and the outer joint to the bone that's behind it. Basically, we're just parenting each of the objects to the bone that is going to be moving it. So I'll just speed it up now, and we'll go through these hands. And just check I've done these. You can check by looking in the relationship. Yeah, they've been done. Now we'll do the same for this side. Alright, and if we just check, go to pose mode, and I'll select all these bones, and I'll rotate them on the local Z. We'll do it for individual origins. And hopefully these will all work, so that's working fine. This one's not working, I need to make sure I add this one in. And then I'll quickly wiggle the rest of the bones to make sure there's no geometry not moving that should be moving. I don't think I did this side yet, did I? No. And of course, let's not forget, we also need to add the head to this. So let's go back up to the top, turn on the lips and the eyeball, choose both of these objects. We'll parent these to this head bone, Control P, bone. We've also got the bit inside as well. We need to now set up the armature for IK. And one thing we need to do is bend the bones a little bit to give the IK a hint which way a bone should bend. For example, this one wouldn't bend this way, it would bend this way. So we're going to need to set that up just with a slight bend for each of the areas that the IK will control. So this arm, and then this leg, if we go into side view, we'll rotate this forward a bit so that we can rotate this one back. That gives us a bit of a bend. And then we'll go into orthographic and just line this up now. Rotate it forward. And then we'll copy the ones we've changed. So this one, this one, this one, and this one. And we'll right click, copy pose, and then we'll right click and paste flipped. So let's put all those changes to the other side of the model. And now we need to choose this bone in the middle and just bring it back, bring the character back down so that its feet are touching the floor again. So GZ, bring it down, and we're about there. Now when we go into edit mode, you'll notice it flips back, which I don't want. So go back into pose mode, and we'll just say pose, apply pose as rest pose. And now when we go into edit mode, everything will stay in position. So this is the new rest pose basically. Now we need to create some IK controller bones. So still in edit mode, we'll start with the wrist, elbow on both sides, and also the ankles. And we'll do EY and extrude those out. And then we'll shift click all those bones we've just created. So if I shift click this one, and now this one, we've now got this bone selected in the middle. I can't find a way to select just these two bones in edit mode. So the workaround I've got is if you go into pose mode, and then choose all the bones, and then go back into edit mode, it will just have those ones selected. And then we can do Alt P, and we'll clear the parent. This one, we're going to move back on the y-axis. And then we're going to create two for the knee as well. So this one, and then EY. Select that one and that one. Alt P, clear parent, GY, bring those forward. And the reason we've done that is just so that when we move the arms and the legs, we don't want those bones following along. So before I start making these IK bones control the rest of the armature, I'm just going to make things a little bit easier for myself when I start animating by doing a little bit of organisation. So let's take all these IK bones that we've just created. So we'll select them all. And we're going to put them into a layer. So we've got in the armature panel, the layers section, and it's similar to putting something in a collection. You just hover the mouse over the viewport and you press M on the keyboard. And then you click the layer that you would like the selected bones to go into. So I'm going to put them into this one here. And you'll notice it would appear straight away over here. But they've disappeared from the viewport because this one is not currently blue. If we shift click on it, then they'll come back. It'll turn blue and they'll be visible. Now in Blender 4, this is a little bit different. It's a bit easier, in fact. So we've no longer got the sort of images of little dots in squares. We've now got this bone collections list here, which basically gives us a list of unlimited number of bone collections, whereas before we were limited to something like 32. So all we do now, very simply, is still do the same. We press M, and we say new collection, and then we'll name this to whatever we want. So IK controllers, and say OK. And now we've got this new collection at the bottom, which we can then turn off and on just using the eyeball we've got down here. Now, if you are using 3.6 or below, then we might as well take advantage of these little icons we've got at the top right-hand corner to organise those into a sort of a structure that represents the shape of the figure. neck here, right leg here, left arm, left hand, right arm, right hand. So I'll quickly do that. I can bring back just the bones I want to work with. So just IK when I'm animating, doing inverse kinematics animation, or if I'm doing FK, I can work with just these ones here so that the viewport doesn't get too cluttered. Then the next thing we'll do is create some bone groups. So bone groups will allow us to easily select and deselect bones in the viewport without having to manually grab them. Useful for places like the fingers, for example. Now, in Blender 4, we don't need to worry about bone groups because we've got bone collections, which incorporates the functionality of bone groups into it. So we can assign the bones to one or multiple collections using the assign button, and then we can select and deselect bones just by clicking on the collection and then clicking select or deselect button at the bottom of the bone collection panel. But let's go back to Blender 3.6 just in case you are using that one. So let's select all these fingers. We'll create a bone group and I'll call this fingers R and click assign. Make sure you deselect everything and then select the next ones you want. Add a new bone group. And we'll call this thumb R and don't forget to assign and then deselect. I'll do the same on this side as well. And I'll only do it for the finger bones because they're the most difficult to select. So we'll just test those out, they're working fine. So now for the really cool bit, and this is setting up the IK joints so that when we move these little bones, they will move the rest of the armature for us without us having to manually rotate bones individually. So with the armature selected, make sure you're in pose mode. Let's start with the upper forearm, with the right hand side forearm, and we're going to go into the constraints and add an inverse kinematics constraint. For the target, we're going to click on this bone here. This is the one that's going to be driving this chain. And for the bone, we want to choose this bone. We can't use an eyedropper, so let's just find out what the name is. And we'll actually rename it. So F2, and I'll rename this to IK right hand. So I'm actually making a little bit of a mistake here, and I'll realise this shortly, but it requires me to rename these bones again. So the problem is I'm using IK right hand, when in actual fact I need to use the same name on left and right and just affix it with an R or an L. So make sure you use IK hand.R and use that same convention for the other bones that I'm about to rename. And we'll select the elbow one, F2, and we'll call this IK right elbow. Choose this bone again to get the constraint back. I'm going to choose IK right hand. For the pole, we're going to choose this bone here. And then we're going to set the bone to be IK right elbow. And you'll see it goes weird, and that's because we need to specify the length of the chain of bones that this IK bone will control. So in here we've got the chain length, we'll set this to 2 because we've got 2 bones, the forearm and the upper arm. And if we go into wireframe, you can see we've got this little yellow dashed line which indicates where the last bone is. Let's go into pose mode and we'll just test it out. So that's working. I'll just test the pole target as well. And this one controls what the elbow looks at. And now we're going to do the same for this side. So we'll just click this bone, shift click this bone, pose, constraints, and then copy constraints to selected. We need to change, of course, on this bone, the ones we're using. So let's just rename these. So choose this bone again, and then we'll change this one IK left hand, and this one IK left elbow. And we can see this one is actually pointing in the wrong direction. So it's pointing 180 degrees in the wrong direction. So let's change this to the pole angle to 180, so that will correct it. And now we'll test it out. That's working, and this one's working as well. Moving on to the legs. And this one's going to be a little bit tricky because there's a bit of a problem which I've set up on purpose, and that's the story I'm going to stick to, just in case you run across these problems yourself. So what we're going to do, same again, go into the bone, choose the inverse kinematics. Let's just quickly rename all the leg bones. So we've got this bone selected. It's orange because we've not finished filling it in. We're going to choose the target. It's going to be the meta rig. So we could actually click any bone in there. And then for the bone, we're going to go IK right foot. For the pole target, we're going to go meta rig. That's the name of the rig. And then for the bone, IK right knee. Again, we need to set the chain length because at the moment it's going all the way to the pelvis and we just want it to go to the top of this leg here. So set the chain length to 2. And we need to change the pole angle. And if you're not sure whether it's positive or negative, you can just use the pole angle and just drag it and it'll tell you. So at the moment I'm dragging towards the negative and that's going in the right direction. So I'll set this to negative 90. And now it's looking in the right direction. Now the problem is, if we go into side view, we can actually see it's changed the angle of the foot. So we don't want that. That's a bit of a problem. Turn it off, then it's going to go back to how it was. And that's because basically this is trying to look towards the head of the IK bone. So there's 2 solutions. We can either disconnect everything that's parented to this bone. So if we come out of bone mode, we'll select this one and this one. In fact, the inside one, this one, and then this part here as well. And we'll just say Alt-P, clear parent, and just make sure if we're going to pose that the geometry doesn't move. That's fine. We need to extend this bone down, but we need to make sure we extend it without it breaking that alignment with the knee joint that we aligned to earlier. For example, if we go into edit mode and select the shin bone, you'll see local no longer works because that's actually now local to the rig, not the bone. So we need to change this to normal. And we're going to bring this down. Let's go into front view, orthographic, just so we can get it more accurate. Just this end bone. So press G and then Y to limit it to move on the Y axis only. And now we need to align the IK foot bone and also the actual foot bone to the new position of the bottom of that piece we've just moved. So we'll select the little head knob that we've just moved, Shift S and cursor to selected. And then we're going to take both these foot bones, so the foot bone and the IK foot bone, and just say Shift S, selection to cursor, and that's going to move those across. If I come out of edit mode, all the foot geometry is going to move across because they're already parented. And these ones we're going to need to move across manually because they're no longer parented. So we'll just use the existing 3D cursor, Shift S, selection to cursor. So that's going to snap that back into place with the joint. And then for the actual leg geometry, we're going to need to rotate that. So let's put the 3D cursor up here and we'll change the pivot point to 3D cursor. I'm just going to rotate that now until it's roughly in place. Just make sure as well that we're not introducing any overlaps with the geometry on this leg. So that's one way we could do it. And if we're going to do it that way, we'd probably want to modify the geometry a little bit by going into edit mode, selecting the top edge loop, and then using our trusty old friend, the shear tool, to align it better to the joint. Just make sure we bring the pivot point back to medium point so we can see it, and then we'll change the transform orientation to view instead of normal. And then because we've got proportional editing turned on, it will also manipulate the geometry in a nice smooth fall off. And of course, after we've done that, we need to reparent. I'm just going to rotate this a little bit as well on this side. So let's set it back to 3D cursor for the pivot and just rotate that a little bit so it's more central at the bottom there. All right, and then we'll turn the bones back on so we can see them. And we need to reparent this one, and also this inner part here to this bone again. So into edit mode or pose mode, whichever. Choose this bone, back out, Control P, and then set parent to bone. Back into pose mode. If I move this now, we need to turn this back on. Everything should work properly. Now, one other option, if you can't be bothered with doing all that reparenting, would be to go into edit mode. We'll select the head of the foot bone, so this bone here, and the tail of the shin bone, and then we'll press F to join them together. And this bone now, if you just check, the parent of this bone is still shin L. and this one's called bone. This one's shinel. So we need to click this one, shift click this one, Control P, keep offset, and this bone now is connected to bone, and this one should be connected to shinel. That's correct. And we can now change this to connected. We can actually do that on this one as well. Change that to connected. And then back into pose mode. We'll click this one. We'll shift click this one, and we'll go into the constraints, and we'll click this one and say copy to selected. So that's just an alternative way than using the pose menu constraints, copy constraints to selected. Of course, we're using the wrong bones, so we'll click on this one and need to change this to IK left foot, and the pole target needs to be IK left knee. And of course, instead of 2 chain lengths, because now we've got this extra bone, it needs to be 3. So just to check, you can see this yellow dotted line is only going to the knee. It needs to go to the top. So add 1 more chain. Let's see what's happening there. So that's working correctly now. Let's give this a try. Now, one issue, if we come in here, you'll see that this joint, this ball is leaving the socket. And that's because this bone here is rotating. So let's select this bone. We're going to the bone properties, and then we're going to limit under the inverse kinematic section. We're going to lock it on all axes, just so that it can't bend. So effectively, it's just an extension of this bone, which will allow the IK to work properly. So there's the 2 options you've got. Either one's fine. I don't want my robot to be lopsided though. So I'm going to go with the method on this side, on the left side, because it looks a bit tidier. So I'll quickly do that. And then for better control, I'd like the feet to inherit the rotation from the IK foot instead of from the shin, just to give us a little bit easier control when we're animating. So I'll select both feet, and then I'll Alt-click on Inherit Rotation, so that both bones no longer inherit from the parent. Now if I move this, the foot won't rotate along with the shin. And then to control the foot's rotation with the IK foot's rotation, grab this bone, and we're going to use a copy rotation. We're going to get the rotation from this bone here, and it's going to be IK right foot. And the target space needs to be local space, owner orientation, and the owner space needs to be local orientation. Make sure we change the pivot point back to median. Rotate this, and that will now rotate the foot. Then we'll do the same for this one. And then, when we bounce the robot up and down, it should all work. I've just noticed the socket that goes into the pelvis on the right hand side there isn't parented. So I'll just select the joint that is correctly parented and in the right place, and put the 3D cursor to it. Cursor to selected, and just grab this bone, Shift S, selection to cursor, put it back in space. We need to parent this to this bone here. Control P, parent bone. Try that again. That's better. And then the very last thing for these legs, just to make sure we get no problems when we're using inverse kinematics, if I just move this one up in pose mode, let's move this over here. Let's just temporarily turn off the armature so we can see what's happening. You can see this part of the joint is going out of line. And basically that's because the bone itself that controls this joint is not being restricted to the individual axis that this joint can only physically rotate on in real life. So to ensure it does, we'll select this bone, we'll go into the bone parameters, and under the inverse kinematics section, we've got the option to lock the axes. Now we can see here, if we change this to local, that it's the Z axis that I want to rotate around. So we'll lock the X and Y, and now you can see it snaps back into place. And no matter where I move the IK foot to now, the joint and the bone that controls it will only rotate in a physically plausible way. So Alt-G, let's put that back to where it was, and Alt-R just to make sure I've not rotated it. And we'll do the same for this one as well. And just double check it works. That's fine. And now we're going to move on to the neck. So the neck, again, similar scenario. We're going to go into edit mode. We're going to get this bone here, change it to active element, and we're going to change it to normal. And then E, and we're going to extrude on the Y. So it's in line perfectly with the head bone. We'll select the bone, Alt P, and we're going to clear the parent because this is going to be the controller for the IK. And then we're going to go back into pose mode. Just to do it a little bit quicker this time, we're going to click on the IK bone, and then we're going to shift click on the bone that we want the IK constraint to be added to, and we'll do Shift I. That will automatically add the IK to this. We'll go to the constraint, and you can see that's being set up for us, so a little bit quicker. And we need to change the chain length so it goes to the last bone, which in my case is 3 chain links. And this time, different to the other times, I want to inherit the rotation from the IK bone. So at the moment, that kind of works. If we turn on inherit rotation, because it's aligned perfectly already, everything will stay where it currently is. Choose this bone, R, Y, rotate that around, and you can see it's working. We've got a few issues. So you notice this part here is breaking away. And if I move this across, this part here is also breaking away. So to fix these two items, we'll go to this bone, we'll go into the bone properties, and we need to lock. So we need to lock the IK so that it can only rotate on one axis. And in this case, let's just change this to local. We can see it's the x-axis is the one we want it to be able to rotate on, but not on the z and the y. So we'll lock the z and the y, and that will fix that. And for this one, we will need this to only rotate on the x-axis as well. So y and z, lock those. And this one, we can just see it's breaking through there. We only want this one to rotate on the y-axis. So we'll lock the z and the x. And there we are. So if I now move this IK bone, you see we've got excellent control. And if we rotate it, we can get it to look around and everything works perfectly. And just to ensure this head bone doesn't move around when we rotate the waist. So for example, if I do this, you'll notice the head staying in place, and that's because this bone, the IK for the head, isn't actually parented to anything. So let's go into edit mode. I'm going to parent this bone to the bone above the pelvis. Shift click, Control P, and keep offset. And now, if we go in pose mode and rotate this pelvis, the head will no longer try and compensate for that. And same if I rotate this as well. The next thing I want to cover is the hands. I want these to be able to be rotated by the IK bone. At the moment, they don't. You can only rotate it with the hand bone itself. So to do this, we'll go into edit mode, we'll choose this bone and this bone, and we'll say Control P to parent it to this bone. And now if we come back into pose mode, rotate this, it will rotate the hand. The issue is, if I move that bone, the hand's going to fly away. So to fix that, we'll select the hand bone in pose mode, into the constraints, and we're just going to add a copy location. And we're going to tell it to copy the location of the forearm on the right hand side. And we need to change the head tail so that it's on the tail, not the head. And now it will be perfectly aligned to the end there. And if I move this, that will fix that. So I'll quickly do the same on the other side. And one last thing that we can improve is when we want to rotate the feet, generally we'd want the foot to stay in contact with the floor at either the heel or the toe. So we want it to be static and rotate from those points. Whereas at the moment, it rotates from the ankle, which will make animating a little bit more difficult than it needs to be. We could use, of course, the 3D cursor and change the pivot point to 3D cursor. And now when we rotate, it will rotate around that 3D cursor as the pivot. And that will allow you to do things like tap the heel or, stub out a cigarette, for example. But to save us from constantly having to change the 3D cursor position and then change the pivot point in the system as well, what we can do is actually add a few extra bones. So we'll go into, select the shoe, we'll go into edit mode, select this bottom face on the heel, and we'll do Shift S, cursor to selected. Come out of edit mode, we'll go and click on the armature, back into edit mode, Shift A, and that will add a new bone. We can scale that bone down, and then we'll rotate it on the x-axis by 90 degrees. And I want to go into side view and just align this with the front of the toe. So in the center of the front of the toe, if you want to be accurate, you can go into wireframe and just get this little point of the bone to the front of the shoe about there. We'll then extend another bone outwards like this, and we're going to parent this one, so the IK, to this one here. So Control P, keep offset, and we're also going to parent the foot bone. Instead of to the shin, we're going to parent it to the foot IK so that it can inherit the rotation of the foot IK. We go into pose mode, set the pivot back to median. If I rotate that, it's working as it was before, so it's not working yet. And if I rotate this one, it's flying away. So we've got a few things we need to fix. Firstly, we need to get rid of the copy rotation. Turn that off. Let's try again. So now it's not rotating at all, and that's because we need to inherit the rotation from the parent. So that fixes that. We're back to where we were. But now, if I want to rotate on the toe, I can do that using this front bone. And if I want to rotate on the heel, I just rotate on this one. And we can move this one around. Just be careful, don't move this one around. Otherwise, the heel and the toe will no longer be aligned to the new bones that we've created, and rotation will be incorrect. We'll repeat the process for this side. And then all we've got to do is fix the foot flying away on both of these. So into constraints, copy location. This is going to be the location of the shin on the left hand side, and slide it to the tail, and then we'll repeat that on the other foot as well. Give it a quick test and it should be all good. And just to make this rig a little bit more attractive, we'll replace some of these bones with more descriptive shapes. So let's come out of edit mode. We'll put the 3D cursor back to the world origin, Shift C, and then Shift A. I'm going to add a mesh circle. 64 vertices. I'm going to scale it down to approximate hand size and apply the scale. Let's just turn this into a hand. Make sure we're in orthographic view, top view. Into edit mode, vertex mode. Let's just flatten it down a little bit on top first. So I'm making sure I've got the proportional editing turned on. I'm going to select a few fingers. Let's change it so that they all go outwards based on their own local normal. So orientation mode, normal. And we need to change it to individual origins, so they all use their own normal. And then G, Z, and we can move those out and use the proportion editing just to control the fall off. So about there to start with. And then I'll do it again. And then maybe turn the proportion editing down a bit. And then let's make sure we turn connected only on, so we only affect the one area. So if I move this, for example, turn it right up, it won't affect this finger over here. It will sort of work its way down through the mesh. Let's just modify it a tiny bit. And you can bevel sharp points by Control B and then pressing V to bevel the vertices. And I'll just continue moving stuff around until it looks a bit less embarrassing. There we go, something roughly like that. And then what I'll do is go into edge mode this time. I'm going to select all the edges and right click, and I'll choose the mesh tools, which is an add-on that comes with Blender, so make sure you enable that. We'll choose offset edges. And then we can control the offset just by dragging this in the redo panel. So we've got a bit of an inset. And then select all the edges, right click, and we'll choose to bridge the edge loops. There we go. So I've got a hand model. I'll keep it 2D. You could extrude it and then subdivide it if you wanted to, but for me I prefer 2D. So I'll rename this to hand, and let's put it into the armatures container. Let's come out of edit mode. I'm going to duplicate this now and make it a foot from it. So Shift D, duplicate that. Let's rename it to foot in here. We'll just hide the hand one. Let's see how badly I can make this look. So into edit mode, I'll probably, just to make it easier, select this inside loop, X, and then delete the vertices. So we're left with just the outside again. There we go, something like that. Then into edge mode, we'll do the same as before. Right click, mesh tools, and then offset edges. And it remembers the last one, so that's fine. We'll select all the edges. Oh, in fact, actually, got a bit of an overlap there. So with all those vertices selected, we'll open loop tools and then choose relax, and that should fix that problem. Bridge the edge loops again. There we go, so we've got the foot. And we'll just create a couple more, so one for the hips and the spine, and then one for the pole targets as well. Let's just move this foot geometry so it's a bit more central to the origin. We can hide these now, so let's hide them in the viewport. So back out of isolation mode, I'm going to start assigning these new shapes we've created to be used by the bones of the armature that we're going to use to control the animation of the inverse kinematics. So let's start with this foot. We'll go into pose mode, importantly. We'll click on this bone and also this bone, and then we'll go into the bone tab over here. And under viewport display, we've got the option to choose a custom object. So I'm going to click on this, I'm going to type in foot, and I'm going to hold the Alt key whilst I press enter, and that will make sure that it assigns it to both. Both of these I want to turn off the scale to bone length, so again, hold the Alt key and click on this one. And I want both of these to be rotated by 180 degrees on the Z-axis. So again, 180, Alt, enter, that will turn them around. And they could do with sliding forwards a bit as well. So hold the Alt key down and then drag these forward. We'll do the same for both hands. Don't forget you can scale on the negative if you want to flip the thumb to the other side. And the pole targets, the pelvis and lower spine, just using the custom shape, scale, translation and rotation to get them into place. And if you don't want back faces to be see-through, then you can just go into edit mode on the objects and extrude them a tiny bit. And then both sides will be visible in the viewport. And if you get any weird artifacts on these replacement bones, then just check the original objects have got the normals pointing in the correct direction. And if not, go into edit mode with those objects selected and press Shift N. And that should improve the problem, although you might still get these little weird flickery wireframes popping up occasionally. Let's go back into the armature panel, select all the bones we're going to use to control the model in IK mode. And then we'll put these onto the same layer, same as before, just by pressing M and then choosing the one we want them to go onto. Put them on this layer here. We'll just turn that layer on so we can see them again. And in Blender 4, this is going to be different again, because obviously we're using bone collections. So what we're going to do, let's just get rid of all these collections that have been created for us by the Rigify add-on. So let's get rid of all these. And we'll just leave the IK controllers one that we've created. Let's get rid of all those. We're left with just this one. And this will just turn that off. It's going to get rid of all those. So let's put these bones, all the ones we've got left, into their own collections very quickly. So I'm just going to go through, select the finger bones initially, press M. I'm going to put those into right fingers. And then we'll hide it. And I'm going to go through and do this for all of the bones. So I'm going to put the arms into right arm, hide it, and I'll just go through and do that for the rest of the armature. And there we go, and we can just unhide the ones that we're going to be wanting to control. And I'll just make sure I put these toe bones into the collection in Blender 3.65 as well, so into that same, well, it's not really a collection, but that same layer. And in 3.65, we can just click on that one layer and that will isolate or solo those bones only. It's also a good idea to set bone colours just to help you more easily find the bone you're looking for when you're animating. And in Blender 3.6, it's very straightforward. Basically, you put them into a bone group, and then you can assign each bone group a colour. So I'll quickly do that for all the bones. And in Blender 4, it's been simplified a little bit. We no longer have bone groups because we can use the bone collections for selection, but we can still assign different colours. So if we go into the bone tab this time, then we can come down to the viewport display, we can choose the bone colours here. So bone colour and post bone colour can be set differently as well. So let's just choose, for example, both of the feet. I want these to be a specific colour, so I'll go to bone colour, and we'll just do it the same, so red, and it's only done the active one, so let's just undo that. I've got both selected, so what I'm going to do is click on this, and then I will Alt-click. So Alt-click, and this is going to do both of them. So I'll just go through and assign colours to each of the IK controller bones. I just want to make sure as well, I don't want these to be visible. They shouldn't be in there, so I'm going to grab these two. So I'm just going to put these into a new collection called IK, and we'll have this one hidden because I don't want those to be visible because I'm not going to be controlling them. And then I'll quickly model some bone replacement objects for the head bone and for those toe bones as well. And then assign those in the custom object property of the bone tab. But this time, instead of trying to rotate them using the custom object scale, translation and rotation properties, it's going to be a little bit easier if we just modify the rotation of the actual vertices of the original object in edit mode. And now we should be able to get away with turning off the in front because everything is actually visible anyway. And that will make it much easier for us to animate. And also, just in case we want to do a walk cycle, where it'd be handy to be able to move everything around at once, we'll add a master bone by going into edit mode. Make sure the 3D cursor's at world 0, Shift A, and we'll shrink this one down. Just make sure we change it to active element and scale that down. And we need to parent all the bones that control the character to this bone so we can move them all around at once. So obviously we don't need to parent like the arms and the fingers and things because they're all children of this pelvis bone. So we can just select the pelvis bone. And then for the IK, we need to select them all. So the pole targets, the feet, you don't need the toes because they're children of the main foot bone. Then the hands, pole targets for the elbows, neck. And then finally, click on this one and then Control P and keep offset. And if we go into pose mode now, we can move this bone around and all the other bones will follow along with it. And we'll just make it a bit more obvious what it does by giving it a custom shape. Then we can move it around and rotate it all at once. And you'll remember earlier when I was naming the IK bones as IK left hand and IK right hand instead of IK hand .R and .L. The reason for that is any bone position that you want to be able to paste to the other side. Let me show you. If I move this up, if I want this to be, if I don't want to swap the pose, so if I bring this one forward, so that these are sort of swapped over, normally what you'd do is you'd select them both, right click, copy pose, and then you'd right click and you say paste flipped. Now it's not working, and the reason is we need to change the names of the bones so that the identical bones on the left and right, like the feet for example, begin with the same name but end with .L on the left and .R on the right. So we'll change the left to mainfoot.L. And now if I do the same thing with both feet selected, copy pose and then copy paste flipped, you'll see it will work. So for all of those controller bones that we've just created, just double check you've got all the names as .L and .R so that we're able to paste those flip poses later on when we start animating. And if you then copy and paste that from one side to the other, it will then work. Next up, we'll take a look at how animation works and the animation tools that Blender provides us with.